"The treaty is signed in poisoned ink, Master." The young Senate page Piso barely whispered the words, his face pale beneath the heavy oil lamplight of the Basilica Aemilia. Outside, the crowd cheered for General Caius Valerius, victor of the Germanic campaigns, celebrating the political marriage to Princess Lyra of the Marcomanni. The massive bronze doors shut with a clang that seemed to seal their fate. Piso knew the general did not hate his new wife. He feared her father and the barbarians' unbroken spite. But worse, Piso had seen the way Valerius studied the rise and fall of Lyra's throat when she drank. This was not a peace alliance. This was a slow, deliberate surrender of Rome's discipline to a woman carrying the ghosts of 3,000 lost legionaries. General Caius Valerius stood on the balcony of his newly assigned residence on the Palatine Hill, the roar of the celebratory Feriae, a dull tide below. He was the embodiment of Roman law, 35 years old, forged in the relentless sun of the eastern frontier, his face carved granite, his posture incapable of softness. He wore the formal white toga of a newly appointed consul-elect, but beneath the immaculate wool, the old scars on his forearm pulsed with phantom aches. His routine was military: wake before dawn, review reports from the Rhine frontier, exercise until sweat dripped onto the marble floor, then endure the endless line of supplicants and politicians seeking favor from the man who had just brokered peace through marriage. His personal guard, a detachment of Praetorians, moved with seamless silence, reflecting the general's own discipline. When he spoke, even to his most trusted centurions, the air chilled slightly. His authority was absolute, rooted in blood spilled and battles won. Just yesterday, he had dictated the terms of the garrison placement in Pannonia, ensuring that even under the treaty's facade, Rome's grip on the Danube remained iron. He was celebrated as the shield of the empire, the man who knew how to silence the rebellious tribes, not just with steel, but with calculated political maneuvering. Yet, as the dawn broke over the city, washing the forum in a pale gold light, Valerius did not look at the monumental arches erected in his honor. His gaze was fixed on a small, unadorned silver locket tucked into the folds of his tunic. Inside, there was no image of his arranged bride, Lyra, nor of the emperor. It held a wisp of ash and a dried sprig of lavender, the last tangible remnants of his first wife, Octavia. Octavia had been a Vestal virgin until the Senate, desperate for a powerful heir to secure Valerius's loyalty, had pressured her release for marriage. She had lost her life 3 years prior, giving birth to a son who lived only a few hours. Valerius had loved the discipline in Octavia's eyes, the quiet strength that mirrored his own sense of duty. Her death had been a betrayal by the gods, a testament to the brutal inefficiency of fate. He had returned to the legions immediately, burying his grief in the grind of war. Now he was married again, to a woman who smelled of foreign forests and whose people had butchered his men. He was expected to consummate this union, to produce a legitimate Roman heir from barbarian stock, binding the treaty with bloodline. He felt the vast emptiness of his house. The silence was not the peace of home, but the echoing void of purpose, the chilling realization that all his duty, all his power, could not purchase a simple, unscarred life. He was a machine built for the empire, but the mechanism was grinding against a profound, unacknowledged guilt. He had allowed the state to strip Octavia of her sacred vows, and in return the state had demanded her life. He clutched the locket, the metal digging into his palm, a silent acknowledgement that his greatest victory was hollow. The peace he brought to Rome only magnified the private war raging within his own heart. The cheers below seemed to mock his inability to feel anything but cold, functional obligation. Narcissus was not a man of power, but a man of dust. He was the Ostiarius, the chief gatekeeper of the Palatine estate, responsible for ensuring the general's private entrance remained impenetrable, yet clean enough to satisfy Valerius's demanding standards. His body, thick and low to the ground, carried the weight of 50 years spent serving various domini. His clothes perpetually faded, smelling faintly of old leather and olive oil. His life was defined by the brass keys heavy at his belt and the relentless creak of the hinge he had to oil every night. His limitations were physical and social. He was invisible to the senators, a shadow to the Praetorians. His true exhaustion wasn't from the long hours, but from the constant vigilance required to remain unnoticed, to avoid becoming an anecdote or a mistake that could cost him his position. Narcissus had a small private fear that fueled his diligence. His granddaughter Lydia, orphaned and feverish, lay hidden in a rented room in the Subura. The meager wage from the general was all that kept the fever at bay, all that purchased the goat's milk and the simple unguents. Lydia was his future, his secret shame, and his only reason for enduring the suffocating air of the Palatine. He sat on his low wooden stool by the inner courtyard entrance, polishing the bronze fittings of a ceremonial spear, his gaze fixed on the new arrival, Lyra, the Germanic princess, now Domina Valeria. She moved through the Roman house with a strange, deliberate grace, neither defiance nor submission, but something akin to observation. Her foreign dress had been replaced by Roman silks, her hair pinned in a style that tried and failed to mask the wildness in her eyes. The other servants whispered about her coldness, her isolation. They saw a pampered barbarian who had traded a hut for a palace. Narcissus saw something else. He saw the way she watched the food before she ate, the minute hesitation before she accepted a cup of wine. He noted the precise location she chose to stand in the main atrium, always near a pillar, never in the direct center of the room, positioning herself with her back protected. Most tellingly, he had found something tucked beneath the cedar chest in her new room during his morning sweep. A piece of dried twine, knotted 7 times in a complex non-Roman pattern. He had burned it immediately, attributing it to superstition. But then, an hour ago, while inspecting the general's private dispatch box before the courier arrived, he saw the second piece of twine, identical to the first, tied to the leather binding of a map detailing troop movements near the border. It wasn't a charm, it was a marker. A message, a warning. Narcissus rubbed the dull bronze spearhead, his knuckles white. The princess was not merely surviving in this house. She was monitoring it. She was counting the general's breaths. He knew with a sudden chilling certainty that the peace treaty was a cage for both the general and the princess, and that Lyra was actively testing the bars. He knew something dangerous was happening right under the general's disciplined nose, something linked to the supposed stability of Rome itself, but he did not yet understand the full, devastating pattern. Onde você está assistindo de hoje? The intersection of their lives happened not in a dramatic meeting, but in the sterile silence of the general's private bibliotheca. Valerius, escaping the suffocating demands of dinner guests, was reviewing tactical scrolls concerning the Varian disaster centuries ago, a study in hubris and fatal underestimation of the enemy. The room was cool, scented with aging papyrus and dust motes dancing in the faint light filtering from the garden. Lyra entered the room quietly, not seeking her husband, but seeking the edges of her prison. She moved past the general with the practiced indifference of someone who knew surveillance was constant. She ran her fingers along the spines of the scrolls, recognizing the language of power but not its content. Valerius, distracted by a diagram of a compromised military road, ignored her presence, accustomed to her ghostly meanderings. It was Narcissus, sweeping the marble floor near the bookshelves, who registered the subtle anomaly. Lyra stopped before a shelf dedicated to the minor laws governing captured provinces. Her fingers paused, brushing against the smooth wooden endpiece. She was not reading the Latin titles, she was feeling them. Narcissus noticed her eyes flick toward a small bronze bust of Caesar Augustus perched high above the scrolls, a perfect vantage point over the general's reading chair. Valerius, deep in the text, sighed, dragging his hand through his close-cropped hair, a rare moment of exposed frustration. He rose, walking to the window overlooking the darkened city, and allowed himself 3 full seconds of quiet contemplation. In those 3 seconds, Lyra moved. It was a fluid, nearly imperceptible movement. She did not look at Valerius. She simply reached up to adjust the bust of Augustus. It was crooked. She straightened it. A small domestic adjustment, barely noticeable. But Narcissus saw it all. He saw that the adjustment was deliberate, almost calculated. And as Lyra turned to leave the room, her back to the gatekeeper, Narcissus saw something tiny and grey fall from the pedestal of the bust, landing silently on the high, thick pile of scrolls below. It was a piece of lint, nothing more, easily dismissed. Yet Narcissus, conditioned by years of looking for threats hidden in the mundane, knew that specific bust had been aligned perfectly just that morning, and that specific shelf contained scrolls relevant to provincial tax revenues, a point of ongoing dispute in the Marcomanni negotiations. Valerius turned back from the window, his mind still on the battle maps. He did not see the lint, nor did he notice Lyra pause momentarily near the main archway, her expression unreadable. He merely noted that his foreign wife occupied space differently than the Roman women he was used to. She left an absence rather than a presence. Narcissus kept sweeping, his broom strokes rhythmic and slow. His heart, however, was hammering against his ribs. The lint was grey, matching the uniform of one of the general's most trusted scribes, Titus, and the placement, high above the sensitive military documents, suggested visual access or worse, a prearranged signal. The general was focused on the ghosts of old enemies. Narcissus was watching the enemy operating right under his nose, masked by domestic silence. Something impossible, a web of treason woven with silk and dust, was about to tear the general's life apart. The oddity persisted, growing from a suspicion into a cold, hard knot in Narcissus's gut. The next morning, the general's routine was violently interrupted by a sudden, unscheduled departure for a minor senatorial session at the Curia. Valerius left in haste, overriding the usual protocol for reviewing his outgoing correspondence. Narcissus was tasked, as always, with ensuring that Tablinum, the general's study, was secured. He moved through the room, his calloused hands checking the seals on the cabinets. Everything seemed ordered, reflecting Valerius's meticulous nature. But then he saw the general's official signet ring, usually worn or securely locked in a small iron box, resting carelessly on the corner of the writing desk. It was placed directly atop a sheet of parchment that had clearly been discarded, a draft letter concerning grain shipment logistics to Ostia. A routine detail, inconsequential. Yet, the placement of the massive gold ring, gleaming in the morning light, felt deliberately casual. Narcissus felt the immediate sickening surge of fear. He knew the general. Valerius treated his tools of power with reverence bordering on ritual. The signet ring was never left. It was either worn or secured, never abandoned on a meaningless draft. Hesitantly, Narcissus picked up the ring. It was heavy, cold. Beneath it, the parchment detailing the grain shipments. He smoothed the paper, his eye catching a familiar small detail, a tiny pinprick near the date header, barely visible to the naked eye. It was exactly like the pinprick he had noticed yesterday on the edge of the military map Lyra had passed. He sat down heavily on the general's stool. The pieces were clicking together with terrifying precision. The pieces of twine, the lint from the scribe, the calculated repositioning of the bust, and now the signet ring placed on a seemingly meaningless document with a coded pinprick. The code wasn't about the grain shipment. The grain shipment was the cover. The ring was the mechanism to draw attention to the cover. Someone had used the general's own ring to mark the message. His duty demanded immediate action. Report the suspicious placement of the ring, the coded mark, and the princess's strange activities. His body, however, was anchored by the thought of Lydia's pale face. If he spoke, he was denouncing the general's wife, a political untouchable. If he was wrong, or if his evidence was deemed insufficient, he wouldn't just be executed. He would be sold into the mines and Lydia would perish in the slums. Rome tolerated no mistakes from the humble. He wrestled with the fear. What if Lyra was not aiming for the general's life, but for his reputation, his command? And what if the information being passed, whatever it was, jeopardized the tenuous peace? The blood of thousands of legionaries, including some he had known in his younger days, had purchased this peace. To ignore the signal was to allow a catastrophe. To report it was to commit to a duel with the power structure of Rome. With trembling fingers, Narcissus replaced the signet ring exactly where he found it, covering the small, incriminating pinprick. He then bent down and meticulously polished the small wooden leg of the desk, focusing on the simple, safe action. He had seen the sign. Now he needed proof that wouldn't bury him. He needed to watch Lyra not as a gatekeeper, but as a predator studying its prey. The safety of his granddaughter hung on his silence, but the security of the general, and perhaps the Empire, hung on his sudden need to break it. Narcissus did not wait for the inevitable next coded signal. He knew the window of opportunity was closing. General Valerius was scheduled to depart for Ostia that evening to inspect the coastal fortifications, a trip that would take him dangerously close to the Germanic tribal roots recently pacified by the treaty. If the message hidden in the grain shipments was a map, the destination was the target. The act of courage did not take the form of a shouted denunciation. It took the form of precision and risk. Lyra was in the atrium, sitting stiffly while a Roman matron attempted to instruct her in the proper art of embroidery. It was a perfect charade of submission. Narcissus, armed with his feather duster, moved past her, casually brushing dust from a large marble pedestal supporting a statue of Mars. He saw the flicker in Lyra's eyes as he approached, a momentary tightening of her jaw. She knew he watched her. He kept his pace steady, moving into the private hallway leading to the general's bedroom. His heart was a hammer against stone. He knew the general kept his personal, uncoded journals detailing minor domestic and logistical details in a locked cabinet near the bath, a place no sensible spy would look for military secrets. But spies looked for patterns of life. Narcissus didn't try to access the cabinet. Instead, he went to the general's massive campaign chest, currently staged for transport to Ostia. He knew the contents: extra tunics, maps, ink, and a small flask of expensive Falernian wine. He chose the moment perfectly. The sun had dropped and the shadows were long and blurring. He heard the faint voices of the servants preparing the evening meal. With his hand shaking, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the piece of twine, the second one he had found, the one previously attached to the military map. He ripped a small, inconsequential corner off the official dispatch map, a section that detailed a defunct Roman quarry near Ostia, irrelevant to the general's actual route. Then he wrapped the knotted twine tightly around the torn scrap of map and tucked the tiny bundle deep inside the sleeve of the general's thick winter tunic, folded and ready for the cold sea air. It was a trap. It was small, discreet, and deeply embedded within the general's personal effects, where only the general, or the person searching for specific information, would find it. If Lyra was working alone, she would have no reason to search the general's private luggage again before he departed. If she had an accomplice inside the house, perhaps the grey-clad scribe, Titus, that accomplice would be forced to search for the expected military intelligence that Lyra had signaled. Narcissus retreated to his post by the main gate, the silence heavier than the general's bronze doors. He had not betrayed his granddaughter's need for secrecy, but he had betrayed his silence to the Empire. He had placed a ticking clock inside the most disciplined household in Rome. The next move belonged to the conspirator, and if they moved, they would expose themselves searching the general's personal garments for a message that wasn't there. The cold consequence was immediate. A Praetorian guard walked past him, giving him a long, assessing look, as if sensing the sudden change in the atmosphere. The general's life and Narcissus's miserable existence now depended entirely on whether the enemy had received the general's false signal, the carelessly placed signet ring, and whether they were desperate enough to retrieve the information. General Valerius returned to the Palatine residence late that afternoon, fueled by stale wine and senatorial doublespeak. He was irritable, his mind already on the logistical challenges of the Ostia journey. His trusted chief of staff, Marcus Lepidus, was waiting for him, his face tight with controlled alarm. "General, there has been a disturbance. Minor but unsettling," Lepidus reported, holding a folded piece of linen. "The gatekeeper Narcissus reported an unauthorized presence in your dressing room. He found this." Valerius took the scrap of linen. It was a fragment of a winter tunic, the cloth coarse, easily recognized. Tightly tied to it was a knotted piece of twine, identical to the Marcomanni tribal markers he had seen on intelligence reports. Valerius felt the blood drain from his face, replaced by a searing metallic cold. This was not the chaotic work of a simple thief. This was a direct, precise message, placed in the one area only he, his wife, and a trusted few servants ever accessed. "Where is Narcissus?" Valerius demanded, his voice low and dangerous, the sound of a bowstring drawn taut. Confined, General, in the auxiliary barracks. He claims he did not place it. He claims he found it after he saw Scribe Titus near the chamber. Lepidus paused, noting the general's total stillness. Titus is the grey-clad scribe, General, the one who handles the grain logistics. Valerius did not need confirmation. The discarded grain document, the signet ring, the placement of the bust, it was not Lyra acting alone. It was a coordinated internal threat, using his barbarian wife as the unwitting conduit or the deliberate camouflage. The treaty wasn't a peace. It was an elaborate setup for an assassination or a crucial intelligence leak designed to destabilize the frontier the moment he left Rome. The urgency was immediate and absolute. Valerius ripped off his senatorial toga. He needed to find the source, and he needed to secure Rome's position before his departure tonight became a permanent absence. Lepidus, secure the house. Total lockdown. No one leaves. Bring Titus to the small interrogation room. Immediately, Valerius commanded. And the Princess Lyra. Bring her to the tablinum, not as a prisoner, but as a host. No guards. I will speak to her alone. His mind raced, calculating the risk. If Lyra was innocent, his confrontation might solidify her loyalty. If she was the primary conspirator, he was walking into a trap. But he needed the truth extracted cleanly, without the brutality of a formal interrogation, which would void the treaty. He remembered the small gesture in the library, the straightening of the bust, calculated, quiet. He marched towards the tablinum. The man of power, the general, was now stripped bare. His life, his honor, and the stability of the empire were resting on the precise moment of intersection between his disciplined Roman world and the secretive, desperate world of the humiliated princess and the terrified gatekeeper. He had dismissed Narcissus's place in his life. He had underestimated Lyra's resilience. He realized the gravest error of his military career was assuming that war only happened on the field, not within the marble walls of his own house. He was trapped in a political ambush, and the only path out was through the woman he was ordered to fear, but whom he found himself increasingly curious about. Lyra stood in the tablinum, waiting. She was perfectly composed, her hands clasped before her, watching the general with an intensity that bordered on defiance. Valerius entered, dismissing the Praetorians with a sharp gesture. The room felt small, charged with 3 months of suppressed hostility. Valerius did not use the language of accusation. He used the language of command. He walked to his desk and placed the small fragment of tunic and the knotted twine between them. "I leave tonight for Ostia, Lyra," Valerius began, his voice flat, devoid of warmth or anger. "This was found in my campaign chest. Your people use this knot for military signaling. You understand what this implies." Lyra looked at the twine, then at the general. She did not flinch, but a muscle twitched near her temple. "It implies what Rome wishes to believe, Valerius, that I am a savage incapable of obedience, seeking your demise," she replied, her Latin flawless, though accented. "I know it was not you who placed it there, Lyra," Valerius stated, shocking her into a flicker of genuine surprise. "Your movements are too deliberate, too observed. You signal. You observe the house, but you do not search the luggage. Someone is using you to mask their own movements. Scribe Titus is currently being questioned." The mention of Titus caused Lyra's composure to crack. Her eyes widened, instantly filling with cold fear, not for herself but for the plan. "Titus is a Roman citizen. He is loyal to the Senate, not to—" she started, her voice faltering. "Not to the Emperor," Valerius finished for her. "He is loyal to those who believe my peace treaty is a political weakness, and that my death would restore Rome to a state of necessary endless war. They would install a consul more amenable to seizing your father's lands by force, regardless of the blood debt. The pinpricks on the maps, Lyra. The bust. You were tracking my correspondence. Marking weak points, why?" Lyra hesitated for a long moment, swallowing the lie. She realized the general was not interrogating her loyalty, he was demanding the truth of the danger. The men Titus serves, they approached me months ago," Lyra confessed, the words tasting like metal. "They promised my freedom if I helped expose the general's tyranny and return the power to the Senate. They claimed you were weak. They asked for details of troop movements, things a barbarian would not understand. And you gave them what they wanted, Valerius pressed, leaning closer. I gave them lies, Lyra whispered, looking at the twine. I gave them false logistical reports, the grain shipment details, but marked them as significant. I was signaling my people, not your enemies. My father instructed me, use the Roman greed against them. I was testing the loyalty of your own house to see which Roman would betray you first, so I could report it back to my own family, should the treaty fail. I never planned your harm. I planned for our escape, should Rome break its word. The mentira, the perfect Roman mask of the civilized wife, fell away, replaced by the desperate, calculating warrior. Valerius stared at her, not with anger, but with a sudden devastating comprehension. She was a spy, yes, but protecting her own, using Roman corruption against itself. He had admired her courage in the battlefield, but found unexpected honor in her treason. The confrontation had not ended his peace, but ironically had secured it. Titus confessed, Valerius stated, his voice now carrying a weary finality. He confirmed the plan was to sabotage the Aqua Claudia, near Ostia, blaming my death on structural failure. A diversion, while the frontier garrisons were isolated. Lyra took a sharp breath. Her plan was to track a conspiracy. The conspiracy was real, and it was far deadlier than she had anticipated. They were both pawns, entrapped by the ambition of Roman men. The ice between them shattered, replaced by the terrible heat of shared mortal danger. The consequences were swift and brutal, delivered with the mechanical efficiency of imperial justice. Valerius acted not as a husband, but as the Praetorian commander he truly was. Scribe Titus, along with 4 senators implicated in the plot to sabotage the general and trigger a border war, were arrested before midnight. The investigation revealed their motive, a deep-seated contempt for the peace treaty, which they viewed as a financial burden and a betrayal of Rome's expansionist destiny. They were charged with perduello, treason against the state. The trials would be a political spectacle, but the outcome was certain: loss of status, loss of life. The house was cleansed. The Praetorians, under Valerius's direct order, moved with cold finality. Narcissus, the gatekeeper, was brought before the general in the pre-dawn hours. He stood rigid, convinced his small act of interference had earned him a death sentence. You knew what you were doing. Gatekeeper, Valerius observed, looking down at the humble man. You risked everything not to save Rome, but to save yourself and your family. But in doing so, you saved Rome's consul-elect. Explain how you knew the twine was a code. Narcissus, exhausted and shaking, confessed his observations about the signet ring, the placement of the bust, and the fear for his granddaughter, Lydia. He confessed his simple act of planting the false clue in the tunic to force the conspirator's hand. Valerius stared at the man, recognizing the deep protective instinct that transcended politics. Narcissus had played the game of shadows and survival better than any senator. The price of truth was separation. Valerius could not reward Narcissus without acknowledging the vast political danger Lyra represented. He ordered Narcissus to be secretly transported to Ostia that morning, not as a slave, but as a freedman with enough gold to secure Lydia's health and a small home. Narcissus was permanently banished from Rome, his reward being anonymity and freedom from the toxic politics of the capital. The general watched the humble man disappear into the grey morning light, recognizing a form of honest fear he had long since lost. Lyra's loss was more complex. Her confession had been a moment of shared vulnerability, but it had not voided her allegiance to her people. You exposed their treason, Lyra, but you were still gathering intelligence against me, Valerius stated later that morning, standing in the cold emptiness of the main hall. I am loyal to the peace, General, but not to Rome's certainty that it will last, she corrected. The bond between us cannot be built on this foundation, Valerius concluded. He had to be politically ruthless. He could not trust her fully, but he could not execute her, for that would shatter the treaty and ignite the war the conspirators had sought. He announced to the Senate that Princess Lyra, suffering from a debilitating Roman fever, would temporarily reside at a secluded villa outside the city until she recovered. It was a separation, a cooling of political risk, but also a protection. He was not sending her back to her father. He was keeping her close, removed from the intrigues of Rome, but under his distant, careful watch. The marriage was functionally dissolved in the public eye, preserving his honor and the fragile peace. The general had survived the plot, but he had lost the possibility of a normal life, forever bound to a political shadow of a marriage, defined by duty and distant respect rather than the dangerous, growing curiosity he felt toward the fiercely intelligent woman. Months later, the political storm had settled into a grim calm. Valerius, now consul, had secured the border garrisons and maintained the peace. His image was one of unflinching vigilance, a general who rooted out corruption within his own halls. But the victory felt different now. He no longer clutched the silver locket of Octavia. The past was respected, but the demands of the present were paramount. Valerius returned from a tour of the southern provinces, deliberately avoiding the usual pomp. Instead, he took a solitary ride to the villa overlooking the Bay of Naples, where Lyra was officially recovering. The transformation in Lyra was profound. Removed from the performative prison of Rome, she had established a small, private life. She was no longer wearing stiff Roman silks but simple wool dresses, her movements less guarded. She spent her days tending a garden that mingled Roman herbs with wild Germanic flowers, a subtle blending of two worlds. When Valerius found her, she was supervising the construction of a simple stone shrine, not to Mars or Venus, but to an unnamed deity of the harvest, common among her people. "The fever is slow to leave you, I see," Valerius remarked, standing in the sun, feeling the warmth after months of political chill. Lyra turned, her eyes holding a surprising absence of resentment. "My purpose here is clear, Valerius. I am the physical embodiment of the treaty. I keep the peace by my isolation." Valerius stepped closer. He saw the shift in her. The steel was still there, but it was alloyed with acceptance. She had gained dignity through her solitude. She was no longer reacting to her confines. She was defining them. "I did not come to observe the treaty, Lyra," Valerius stated. "I came because I received a letter from Ostia, Narcissus, the gatekeeper. He wrote to thank me. He said his granddaughter, Lydia, is well and plays by the sea." He included a drawing she made. Valerius unfolded a rough piece of parchment. It was a crayon depiction of a small house, the sea, and a gatekeeper standing beside a tall figure in a general's armor. It was utterly innocent, a child's gratitude. Lyra looked at the drawing, a slow, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time Valerius had ever witnessed. "He found his peace," she observed. "We bought it for him," Valerius countered. He looked out over the sea, the blue reflecting the immense quiet expanse of the empire he protected. "I learned more about honor from the quiet treason of a barbarian princess and the desperate love of a gatekeeper than I did in 2 decades under the eagle. The empire is built not only on law, but on the capacity for human connection, even with those we are ordered to fear." He didn't propose reconciliation, not in the traditional sense. That was impossible under the shadow of the Senate. But he offered something far more binding: shared purpose. "We are bound by the same truth, Lyra. We both work for the fragile balance that keeps the legions home. Continue your recovery, and continue your observations. Report anything that threatens the stability of the frontier directly to me. Uncoded. We can build this peace, not on love, but on necessary vigilance and mutual respect for survival." Lyra looked at the simple stone shrine, then back at the consul-elect. She nodded once, a gesture of partnership forged in shared betrayal and recovered honor. The marriage was a political fiction, but their bond was now a concrete reality, a silent, powerful alliance that maintained the peace through shared knowledge of the shadows lurking in the heart of Rome. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales like this one.